When everything you've built crumbles to dust and your pockets echo with emptiness, what keeps you standing? This isn't a tale about wealth or fortune, but about a young man who had to choose between selling his soul for survival or trusting in something greater than himself. Stay with me until the very end, because you're about to discover that faith opens doors money could never even find. And if you've ever felt like giving up, like the weight of the world was pressing down on your chest and there was no way out, this channel exists for you. We're building a community here, a place where stories remind us that faith isn't just a word. It's the most precious treasure we can carry in our hearts. So come walk this path with us, because every story we share will show you that when you choose faith, you're never truly alone. Caleb Mitchell lived in Grayport, a weathered fishing town where the houses sagged under decades of salt spray and the seagulls circled endlessly above water, the color of old pewter. He was 27 years old, but his eyes carried a weariness that belonged to someone twice his age. His hands were calloused and scarred, marked by countless hours working at Paulson's boat repair yard, where he spent his days welding hulls and patching leaks with the quiet patience of someone who understood that every joint sealed meant another meal on the table. At home, his mother, Grace, waited for him. She'd been fighting diabetes for 5 years now, and the medical bills kept climbing like floodwaters with no sign of receding. Insurance covered barely half, and there were weeks when their dinner menu consisted of nothing but rice, beans, and whatever day-old bread he could get from the bakery on the corner. Still, every single morning, Caleb would wake before dawn and whisper the same prayer he'd been saying since he was a boy. God, hold me up. Give me strength for whatever today brings. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw a faded flannel shirt and knuckles raw from work. But he also saw the determination of someone who'd made an unbreakable promise to himself. He would never compromise his integrity, no matter how desperate things became. His dream was simple, but felt impossibly distant: to study marine welding and one day open his own shop by the harbor. Not for glory or recognition, but so he could care for his mother with dignity and prove that honesty could still be a path forward in a world that seemed to reward the opposite. That particular week, Mrs. Hendricks, the landlady who owned the small apartment they rented above the hardware store, knocked on their door with news that landed like a punch to the gut. Son, the rent's going up $50 starting Friday. You don't have it by then. You'll need to find somewhere else. Her voice carried no malice, just the cold arithmetic of business. Caleb looked down at his boots, his jaw tightening. In his wallet sat exactly enough to cover his mother's insulin for the week, nothing more. Down at the boatyard, old man Paulson called him over with a rare glimmer of opportunity in his weathered face. Boy, I got a big job that just came in. The Harbor Queen needs a complete keel repair. Get it done by Thursday, and I'll throw in a bonus on top of your regular pay. Caleb nodded, his throat tight. I'll get it done, sir. He worked late into the night, the rhythmic hiss and spark of his welding torch the only sounds in the darkness, besides his own thoughts. Every few minutes he'd pause, close his eyes, and breathe deep to keep himself from breaking apart. Lord, you see what we're facing here. On Thursday afternoon, a man named Raymond Cutler showed up at the yard. He was known around town for his sharp suits, sharper tongue, and business dealings that lived in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. He watched Caleb work for a few minutes, then approached with a half-smile that never reached his eyes. Heard you've got a gift for fixing things. What's Paulson paying you? Enough to eat? Enough to keep your sick mother alive? Caleb's jaw clenched, but he kept his eyes on his work. Raymond placed an envelope on the workbench, right next to Caleb's tools. Tomorrow, there's a sealed auction for that old tugboat that's been sitting in the North Berth. Used to belong to a smuggler, they say. If you can get me the exact time they're moving it before the bidders arrive, this money is yours. More than you'd make in 3 months here. Caleb pulled his hand back from the envelope like it was burning. I don't do that kind of work. Raymond's smile widened, though his eyes stayed cold. Think about it, son. Faith doesn't pay the bills. Reality does. He left, but the temptation stayed behind, sitting there on the steel workbench like a coiled snake. That night, the wind came in hard off the Atlantic, howling through the streets of Greyport like something alive and angry. Sarah, a childhood friend who now worked as a nurse at the community clinic, found him sitting alone on the dock, staring out at the black water. "Your mom asked about you today. She's stable for now, but Caleb, we need to get her that new medication the specialist recommended. Without it, I don't know how much longer we can manage her condition." He nodded slowly, swallowing hard against the knot in his throat. "I'll do whatever I have to do, Sarah, but I won't sell who I am to do it. There are some lines I can't cross." Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of bruised metal, heavy with the promise of rain. Caleb had packed a small bag of bagels to take to Sarah at the clinic for her morning shift. As he walked through the empty morning streets, an elderly woman shuffled toward him, her coat threadbare and her eyes clouded with age. "Young man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "would you happen to have any food to spare? Just a little something?" Caleb looked at the bag in his hand. He'd skipped dinner the night before. These were supposed to get him through the day. But he opened the bag anyway and handed her half of what he had. "May God multiply what you've given," she said, touching his arm with surprising warmth. Her hand was papery and thin, but the gesture carried a weight he couldn't explain. He watched her shuffle away into the morning fog, disappearing like a ghost. This doesn't make sense, he thought. Giving when you have nothing left. But something shifted in his chest, a strange peace settling over the constant anxiety that had become his companion. When he got back to the boatyard, he found a slip of paper wedged under the door. North berth, low tide, 5:30 p.m. No signature, just the information Raymond Cutler wanted, the information that could save everything. The doubt hit him like a physical force, driving the air from his lungs. With that money, his mother could start her treatment today. Right now. Hendricks would have her rent. They could eat something other than rice and beans. His phone buzzed. "Mrs. Hendricks, you coming by with that rent? Or should I start boxing up your things? Today, ma'am. I promise." He ended the call, his hand shaking. He looked at the paper, looked up at the gray sky. "God," he whispered, "what if today my faith has to walk on water?" At 5:15, the wind shifted. The gulls went silent, wheeling away toward the inland. Dark clouds rolled in fast and low, swallowing the weak afternoon light. A storm was coming, and it was coming hard. Caleb ran toward the north berth, his boots pounding against wet pavement. Between the black rocks and churning foam, he could see the old tugboat, its hull rusted but still proud in its decay. Next to it, two figures worked quickly with chains and cables, Raymond and one of his men, getting ready to move the boat before the official auction, getting ready to cheat the system. Caleb crouched behind a stack of old crates, his heart hammering against his ribs. He touched the paper in his jacket pocket, his fingers trembling. All he had to do was hand it over, and the suffering would stop. At least for a while. At least for today. Then a scream cut through the wind. "Help! Someone help!" A young girl, maybe 8 years old, had slipped from the pier into the violent water. The current was dragging her toward the rocks, and her mother was screaming on the edge, reaching helplessly as the waves kept pushing her back. Caleb looked at Raymond, who had clearly heard but was focused on his chains, pretending the world wasn't ending 20 yards away. He looked at the little girl, her small arms flailing, her head going under. Time seemed to stop. Every rational part of his brain was screaming that this wasn't his problem, that he had his own crisis to deal with, that survival meant making hard choices. But his legs were already moving. He stripped off his jacket and dove into the freezing water. The cold hit him like a fist, knocking the breath from his chest. Every wave tried to pull him under, tried to drag him down to the bottom where old shipwrecks and forgotten things lay in the dark. He swam with everything he had, his arms burning, his lungs screaming for air. He reached the girl, grabbed her around the waist, and fought his way toward a rocky outcropping where the water was slightly calmer. A fisherman on the pier threw a rope. Together, they pulled the girl to safety, then her mother. Caleb collapsed on the wet stones, his whole body shaking violently from cold and exhaustion and adrenaline. The girl's mother knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "God bless you, son. What's your name?" "Caleb," he managed to say through chattering teeth. She took his hands in hers and held them like they were something sacred, like they were holy relics. Raymond, frustrated that a crowd had gathered and was now watching, slipped away with his helper into the gathering storm. The temptation left with him, dissolving into the rain. Caleb sat there on the cold stones, soaked to the bone, and asked himself a question that seemed to glow with its own light. What's worth more, a stack of money or a life? In that exact moment, the clouds broke open just enough for a single shaft of sunlight to pierce through, hitting the water in a spot where the waves formed strange, swirling patterns. The old-timers who'd gathered to help with the rescue looked at each other with knowing glances. One of them, a grizzled fisherman with white hair and skin like leather, said what they were all thinking. "That's a rip current shifting. When that happens, the tide pulls back fast and uncovers what's been hidden on the bottom for years." Caleb, still trying to catch his breath, watched as the water level dropped rapidly, exposing sections of the seafloor that were normally underwater. The rain had stopped, leaving everything clear and sharp. He walked along the exposed rocks, his wet clothes clinging to him. And that's when he saw it, something metallic gleaming among the seaweed and broken shells. A small chest, corroded green with age, its lock broken away by time and salt water. His hands shook as he knelt down and opened it. Inside, he found old coins, a silver compass, and a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly kept the water out. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. For someone like him, this was a fortune beyond imagining. He carefully unwrapped the journal. The title, written in faded ink, read, "Log of the Northern Star." The pages, stained and fragile, told the story of a merchant ship captain who, during a hurricane, discovered a family stranded on a sinking vessel. Instead of passing by with his valuable cargo, he stopped to rescue them, and in doing so, lost his own ship to the storm. The final entry was dated nearly 100 years ago. "If someone finds this chest someday, I want them to know that the only treasure worth keeping is the kind that saves a soul. Everything else, the sea gives and the sea takes away." Caleb pressed the silver compass to his chest, and tears he'd been holding back for months finally broke free. Not tears of relief about the money, though God knew they needed it desperately. These were tears of recognition, of confirmation. He'd just chosen to save a life instead of selling his integrity. And now, somehow, impossibly, he was holding proof that someone else had made the same choice a century before. He wasn't alone in this. God saw him. God saw what he'd done. And if you're watching this right now and you've ever wondered if choosing the right thing when no one's looking actually matters, I want you to know it does. It always does. Drop a comment and tell us about a time you chose integrity over convenience. We'd love to hear your story. Caleb didn't keep the chest for himself, even though every practical voice in his head was screaming that he'd earned this, that he deserved it after everything he'd been through. Instead, he carried it to the harbor master's office, where the senior fisherman and the town administrator gathered to see what he'd found. He stood there in his still damp clothes, his hands trembling, and spoke with a clarity he hadn't known he possessed. "I found this when the tide went out after the rescue. I want to do this right. I want an appraiser to evaluate it, want the taxes handled properly. If there's a finder's fee according to the law, then I'll accept it. But I need it to be clean. I need it to be right." The town administrator, a stern woman named Margaret, who'd seen every kind of deception in her 30 years in the position, looked at him with something between shock and respect. "In all my time here, I've never seen someone turn in a find like this voluntarily. Most people would have melted those coins down or sold them under the table. I'll contact the Historical Society and the State Archaeological Office. We'll make sure this is handled properly." The news spread through Greyport like wildfire. The young man who jumped into the freezing water to save a drowning child had also turned in a valuable historical find instead of keeping it for himself. People who'd known Caleb his whole life found themselves looking at him differently, seeing something in him they'd missed before, or perhaps something that had always been there but was now impossible to ignore. The next morning, Sarah showed up at the apartment with news that made Grace burst into tears. The clinic received an anonymous donation of diabetes supplies and medication, enough for 6 months. And Caleb, the director wants to talk to you. They need someone to maintain their medical equipment, do basic repairs on their building systems. They asked specifically for you. Said they heard about what you did at the harbor, about your character. Caleb stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. How? Sarah smiled, touching his shoulder gently. Sometimes faith doesn't give you what you ask for. Sometimes it gives you exactly what you need in ways you never expected. The evaluation of the chest took 2 weeks. Representatives from the State Historical Society determined that it was indeed from the Northern Star, a merchant vessel that had disappeared during the Great Hurricane of 1911. The coins and compass were valuable, but more importantly, the journal was a significant historical document. Under maritime salvage law, Caleb was entitled to a finder's fee, a percentage of the appraised value. It wasn't a fortune, not the kind of money that would solve every problem forever. But it was enough. Enough to pay Mrs. Hendricks 3 months of rent in advance, enough to buy his mother the medical supplies she needed and stock the apartment with real food, enough to enroll in a certification course in advanced maritime welding, and enough to lease a small workspace by the harbor with a simple hand-painted sign. Mitchell's Marine Repair. Honest work, fair prices. He quietly declined the reporters who wanted to turn his story into a spectacle, who wanted to put him on local news and make him some kind of hero. Instead, he spent his evenings teaching neighborhood kids basic metalworking and welding, offering free Saturday classes in his shop. He showed them how to measure twice and cut once, how to test a weld for integrity, how to take pride in work done right, even when no one was watching. Slowly, something began to change in the young people who came to his classes. Kids who'd been drifting, who'd been heading down dark paths, started showing up consistently. They started asking questions not just about welding, but about life, about choices, about how to keep going when everything seems stacked against you. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun hung low over the harbor and turned the water gold, a 15-year-old named Marcus looked up from the metal piece he was working on and said, "Mr. Mitchell, if you could make it without selling out, maybe I can too. Maybe there's another way." Caleb smiled, and for the first time in years, the weight he'd been carrying felt lighter. His struggle hadn't been in vain. The choice he'd made when no one was watching had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined. A week later, Raymond Cutler walked into the shop. Caleb was alone, working on an outboard motor, his hands covered in grease. Raymond looked around at the modest space, at the equipment that was old but meticulously maintained, at the silver compass from the chest that hung on the wall above the workbench. "Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying that same smooth edge it always had, "we should talk business. I've got connections all up and down the coast. I can get you contracts that would triple your income in 6 months. Government work, private contracts, the kind of money that would move you out of this tiny shop and into something real." Caleb set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag, looking Raymond in the eyes without anger or fear. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm going to say no." Raymond's expression flickered with irritation. "You're being naive. You think honesty is going to carry you? This is business, kid. This is the real world." Caleb shook his head slowly. "Not all growth comes from the right places. I'm building something here that I can be proud of, something I can sleep peacefully with at night. I've learned that peace of mind is worth more than any contract you could offer me." Raymond stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tight, then turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he paused and looked back. There was something different in his expression now, something almost like regret. "You know what really bothers me about you, Mitchell? You're free, truly free. And I haven't been free in 20 years. He left, and Caleb stood there in the quiet of his shop, understanding that he'd just won a battle Raymond didn't even realize they were fighting. Grace's health improved steadily with the proper medication and regular care. She no longer gasped for breath when climbing the stairs to their apartment. Her color came back, and with it, her smile. In the evenings, she would take her son's hand and pray quietly. "Thank you, Lord. You held him up when the storm was raging and fear was drowning him. You showed him the path when he couldn't see a foot ahead." In the shop, the silver compass from the chest hung above the main workbench where every customer could see it. There were no speeches, no sermons, no long explanations, just the quiet testimony of a life lived with integrity. People noticed. They brought their work to him, not just because he was skilled, though he was, but because they trusted him. They knew he wouldn't cut corners or overcharge or lie about what needed to be done. First, his heart had changed, and then, like ripples spreading across water, his entire world had transformed around him. Young people found hope in his story and his example. His mother's health was restored. He had dignified work that he could be proud of. And most importantly, he carried a quiet peace that no storm could shake, a certainty that he'd chosen correctly when everything had been pushing him toward the easy wrong instead of the difficult right. Caleb came to understand something that changed everything. There was no greater wealth than the peace he now carried in his chest. That tranquility of knowing he'd chosen the right path when the whole world seemed to be shoving him in the opposite direction. He discovered that faith wasn't an easy road or a quick fix, wasn't some magic formula that made problems disappear. But it was the only path that brought true freedom, because money might bring temporary relief, but it could never give you the certainty that you were walking in the right direction. Faith, on the other hand, had held him steady in the storm, had guided him through the darkness, and had shown him that even the smallest gestures, sharing bread with a stranger, diving into freezing water to save a life, could open doors that gold could never unlock. And so, in his small shop overlooking the harbor, with his hands hardened by honest work and that silver compass gleaming softly above his bench, Caleb understood what he'd been blind to before. Chests can be emptied. Coins corrode and get lost. Ships sink and fortunes disappear. Buildings crumble and businesses fail. But faith remains. That simple, stubborn faith was the treasure that sustained him, the gift that no storm could tear from his hands, no poverty could diminish, no temptation could steal away. In the silence of his heart, in those quiet moments before dawn when he still whispered his morning prayer, Caleb discovered the truth that had been waiting for him all along. The most valuable things in life can't be held in your hands. They're carried in your soul. They're written in the choices you make when no one's watching, in the integrity you maintain when compromise would be so much easier, in the courage to do right when wrong would be more profitable. He thought about that elderly woman he'd given bread to, wondered if she'd been an angel testing him, or just a hungry soul who needed kindness. He thought about the little girl he'd pulled from the water, who was alive and laughing, and would grow up to have a life because he'd made a split-second choice to dive in. He thought about Marcus and the other kids who came to his Saturday classes, who were learning that there was another way, a harder way, but one that led to genuine peace. The compass on his wall had belonged to a ship captain 100 years ago who'd made the same choice, who'd lost everything to save people he didn't even know. And now that compass hung in Caleb's shop, a silent witness to the fact that this pattern repeated across generations, that every age had its tests, its temptations, its moments where you had to choose between treasure and truth. Caleb had chosen truth, and in choosing truth, he'd found a treasure that could never be taken from him. So before you go, I want to ask you something. If you found yourself in Caleb's position, standing at that crossroads with the paper in your pocket and your mother's life hanging in the balance, what would you do? Not what you think you should do or what sounds good to say out loud. What would you actually do? Leave your honest answer in the comments below, because this community is built on truth, not pretense. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about your own choices or gave you courage for something you're facing, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because we're building something here, a place where stories of faith and integrity matter, where we remember that the path less traveled is often the one that leads home. And if you want to continue feeding your spirit, strengthening your faith, and reminding yourself what really matters, Watch the next video that appears on your screen. Because when faith is worth more than money, when integrity matters more than comfort, no ocean is deep enough to drown your destiny. Until next time, keep choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. Your soul will thank you for it.